Eric's boots crunched against the dry earth as he made his way through the dense trees, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. The wind carried with it a faint scent of moss and earth, the air thick with the strange magic of the forest of echoed hearts. He had heard stories, stories that spoke of ancient powers hidden within this enchanted forest, a place where the boundaries between the human world and the beasts that inhabited it blurred, a place where even magic could feel alive. But those were just stories. And now, at 57, he found himself here not by choice, but by obligation. The kingdom's high council had sent him to uncover its secrets, hoping he could find something that could bridge the ever-growing rift between humans and beast kind. He had little hope for that, though. Magic had never been kind to him. In his youth, he had been a skilled mage, his name known far and wide. But time had changed things. He had lost too much: his family, his place in the world, and now he wandered in the shadows of his former self. His robes, once pristine, were now worn and frayed. Like him, a relic of something that had long since passed. The path ahead twisted and turned, as though the forest itself were trying to keep him from its heart. His mind drifted as he walked, lost in thoughts of regret and doubt. That is, until a sudden rustle in the underbrush caught his attention. At first, Eric dismissed it as a small animal, perhaps a deer or a rabbit, disturbed by his presence. But the noise was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Something larger was moving, something that followed him through the trees, keeping a careful distance. He slowed his steps, hand instinctively drifting toward the staff at his side. He had heard rumors of beasts in the forest, creatures both human and animal, roaming these woods. Beasts that had once lived in harmony with humanity, but had grown increasingly wary of their human counterparts. The rustling grew louder, and then, just as Eric turned to glance over his shoulder, he saw her. A figure emerged from the trees with the grace of a shadow. Her skin was a soft tan, her eyes a piercing amber, and her long, wild hair cascaded down her back like the fur of a fox. She was no ordinary woman. Her ears, pointed and tufted, protruded from the sides of her head, and a long, bushy tail swayed behind her, catching the light like a glistening extension of her form. She stopped just a few feet from him, her amber eyes fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Eric's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful, but her presence was more than that. There was something wild about her, something primal that made the air around them seem charged, alive. "You're the one they sent," she said, her voice low and smooth, with a slight growl to it, as though it were a voice born of the forest itself. Eric nodded cautiously. I am Eric. I'm here to study the forest, to learn its secrets." Her lips curved into a small smile, though it was not one of friendliness. "Secrets, yes. Many secrets," she murmured, her tail twitching behind her. She took a step closer, and Eric felt an inexplicable pull in his chest, a tension in the air between them. Something about her was magnetic. "Are you a beast?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly despite his best efforts to remain composed. It was a question he had long avoided. She cocked her head, studying him with those amber eyes, as though trying to discern whether he was friend or foe. "What does it matter?" she replied, stepping closer still. "Perhaps I am. Perhaps I am more than that." Before Eric could respond, she moved swiftly, vanishing behind the trunks of the trees as if she were never there at all. He blinked in surprise, caught off guard by how quickly she disappeared. Was she even real? Eric took a cautious step forward, hands still resting on his staff, but there was no sign of her. The air felt still again, as though she had never been there in the first place. He felt the weight of her gaze even now, as if she were watching him from the shadows. "Curious, isn't it?" came her voice suddenly, breaking the silence. Eric spun around, finding her standing not more than 5 feet behind him, her presence more imposing than before. "Curious," Eric repeated, breathless. "Who are you?" "I'm Nira," she replied, her eyes glinting mischievously. "And I've been studying something that belongs to your kind. Something you've long forgotten." Eric furrowed his brow, His curiosity piqued despite his attempts to remain cautious. What are you talking about? Without another word, Nira motioned for him to follow her, leading him deeper into the forest. The trees parted, revealing a small clearing bathed in dappled sunlight. There, lying on a stone pedestal, was an object Eric instantly recognized. It was a relic, an artifact of human design, one that had been lost to history. It was a small, delicate device, its surface smooth and cool to the touch, carved with intricate symbols that Eric couldn't quite place. "What is this?" he asked, stepping forward. "A human artifact," Nira answered. "A device, I believe, meant to unite different beings. I found it deep in the forest. It was left here by your ancestors, wasn't it?" Eric's heart skipped a beat. He had heard of such things in ancient texts, artifacts meant to facilitate reproduction between humans and beasts, meant to bridge the gap between the two species in ways that went beyond mere magic. But it had been centuries since such things were used. They were considered dangerous, taboo even. To experiment with it was unthinkable. "You shouldn't be here," Eric said, his voice stern, trying to shake the tension that had risen in his chest. "This is forbidden. If what you're suggesting is true, it's dangerous." Nira didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she stepped closer to the artifact, her eyes fixed on it with a kind of reverence. "I don't think it's dangerous. I think it's misunderstood. And perhaps," she glanced back at Eric, her gaze intense, "you're the one who can help me understand it." Eric's breath caught. The pull between them was undeniable. But he couldn't. He had to resist. He was a scholar, a man of reason, not a man who would give in to something so primal. But before he could speak, Nira reached out and touched the artifact, her fingers tracing the ancient symbols. The air around them seemed to hum with energy. Eric felt a sudden, inexplicable warmth spread through his chest, a warmth that was both unsettling and oddly familiar. "I think it's time we learn more about this," Nira said softly, her voice a mix of excitement and something darker, something that made Eric's pulse quicken. Before he could respond, the artifact pulsed with light, and everything around them seemed to shift. And in that moment, Eric realized, with a sinking feeling, that nothing would ever be the same again. The soft glow of the artifact pulsed with an energy that was almost alive, casting shifting patterns of light across the clearing. Eric's heart raced in his chest, the warmth spreading through him growing more intense. He could feel the air thickening around him, charged with a strange electric anticipation. Nira's eyes gleamed as she gazed down at the artifact, fingers still caressing its smooth surface. "What have you done?" Eric asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. He instinctively took a step back, though his feet seemed unwilling to obey his command. Nira turned to face him, her expression a mixture of excitement and something deeper, something unreadable. "I didn't do anything," she said softly. "It's the artifact. It's responding to us." Eric's breath hitched as the heat in his chest intensified. The air around them seemed to hum, as though the forest itself were reacting to the artifact's power. The trees swayed gently, and a strange, almost melodic sound seemed to echo through the clearing, like a distant whisper that beckoned them closer. "Responding to us?" Eric repeated, his mind racing. His instincts screamed at him to stop, to pull away, to leave this place. But there was something compelling about Nira's presence, something in her gaze that held him captive. He could see the same curiosity mirrored in her eyes, the same desire to understand what was happening between them, between the artifact and the very air around them. Before he could gather his thoughts, Nira took a step forward, her eyes not leaving his. "I want to understand it," she said, her voice hushed and urgent. "I want to know what it means, what it could mean for us." Eric swallowed hard. "Nira, this is dangerous. You don't understand what you're dealing with. This artifact, these devices, they were meant for a time long past, for practices that were forbidden. You can't simply—" His words faltered as she moved closer still, the heat from her presence sending a ripple of unease through his chest. "I don't care about the rules of the past," Nira replied, her tone low, intense. "I care about what's here, what's now, and what I feel." Eric opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. He was too aware of the way Nira's body moved, too aware of the way the air between them grew thick, heavy with something unspoken. He could feel the pull between them, undeniable, drawing him in like gravity. Her gaze flicked to his lips, then back to his eyes, and in that moment, something within him shifted. He felt the hesitation in his chest, but it warred against the undeniable longing that had begun to bloom between them. "Nira," he said, his voice trembling ever so slightly. This can't happen. It's too dangerous for both of us." Nira's lips parted, as if she were about to argue, but then her expression softened. She reached up slowly, her fingers brushing against his cheek, her touch delicate yet firm. The contact sent a jolt of warmth through his body, spreading from the point of contact, igniting a fire within him that he couldn't explain. The heat was no longer just from the artifact. It was something else, something between them, building with each breath. "I don't think it's dangerous," she murmured, her voice a whisper that seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the moment. "Not if we understand it." Eric's pulse quickened as Nira's hand drifted down his jaw, her fingers lingering for a moment on his neck before she stepped back, her gaze never leaving his. The space between them felt charged, too close and yet too far. The clearing around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Nira finally broke the silence, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I've always wondered what it would be like to understand another being fully, to be more than just separate, to be one." Eric blinked, his mind racing. There was something so raw in her words, something he couldn't ignore. He'd spent so many years alone, wrapped in his studies, in his regrets, that the thought of connecting with someone, truly connecting, seemed almost alien to him. But in Nira's presence, that thought began to feel like a possibility, an unknown path he had never dared to explore. "I don't know if I can," he murmured, unsure of what he meant, unsure of whether he was speaking about the artifact or about himself. "Maybe that's what the artifact is for," Nira said, her voice low, almost coaxing. "Maybe it's to help us understand, to help us share something that's more than magic, more than species, something deeper." Eric took a deep breath, stepping back, though his gaze never left her. The tension in the air was palpable, as though it were about to snap. "This isn't a path I can walk with you, Nira," he said, his voice firm, though his body betrayed him. His heart pounded in his chest, and a heat had settled low in his abdomen. She didn't move. Her amber eyes studied him with an intensity that made his skin prickle, her body still but charged with something that hummed just beneath the surface. "You don't have to walk it alone," she said, almost like a promise, her voice soft but insistent. "Not if you don't want to." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The sounds of the forest faded into the background, and all Eric could hear was the pounding of his own heart in his ears. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to reconcile the feelings stirring within him with the life he had led, the life he had long buried in isolation. "I'm not like you," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've lived a long time alone. I don't know how to be with someone. Not like this." Nira took a step toward him, her expression softening. "Maybe that's the point. We can learn together. You don't have to be afraid of it. We don't have to be afraid." Her words hung in the air like a thread that tied them together, drawing him in, despite his every instinct telling him to resist. Eric stood there, torn between the undeniable pull he felt toward her and the weight of his own fears. But as she reached out again, her hand brushing against his arm, something shifted in him. He could feel the warmth of her touch even through the fabric of his robe, the heat of her skin sending a shock through him. And then the ground beneath them trembled slightly, a low hum vibrating through the earth as the artifact pulsed once more, its light growing brighter. Eric's head spun as the world around him seemed to tilt. The air was thick with magic now, and it was no longer just the artifact that held them captive. The connection between him and Nira had become something tangible, something that could no longer be ignored. "I think," Eric said, his voice tight, "we've already started." And as the artifact pulsed again, its energy surging through the clearing. He couldn't help but wonder just how much further they would go. The humming energy from the artifact pulsed through the clearing, vibrating the very air around them. Eric's heart beat in time with its rhythm, a steady thrum that echoed through his chest. He could feel the tension between him and Nira, the connection between them growing stronger, impossible to ignore. He hadn't been prepared for this, hadn't been prepared for the heat of her touch, the intensity of her gaze, or the way his body responded to her without his consent. Every time she moved, every time she spoke, it was as though the world shifted around them, as though they were caught in a current neither of them could escape. Nira stepped closer, her bare feet moving silently across the forest floor, her eyes never leaving Eric's. She stood just a breath away from him now, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off her skin, could sense the tension in her body. There was something undeniably magnetic about her, something wild and untamed that made his heart race in ways he didn't understand. "Do you feel it too?" she asked, her voice soft and low, a whisper that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. The pull? The way everything is changing. Eric swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He could feel it, the connection between them, the magnetic force drawing him closer with each passing second. But he wasn't sure how to respond. How could he explain the way his body seemed to react to her, to the strange energy of the artifact? How could he explain the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him? His head spun, and for a moment, it was as though everything in the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them standing in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the growing hum of the magic that enveloped them. "I don't know what this is," Eric said, his voice tight with confusion and desire. "But it's more than I ever expected." Nira smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent a shiver down his spine. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against his arm, sending a wave of heat rushing through his body. It was gentle at first, but the touch lingered, drawing his attention to the way her skin felt against his. The warmth of her hand seemed to seep into him, and he could feel his pulse quicken in response. "I think we're both feeling it," Nira said softly, her voice filled with a quiet confidence. "This connection is not just the artifact, Eric. It's us. It's something between us." He looked into her eyes, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to blur. Her amber gaze was filled with something he couldn't quite place, something that made his chest tighten, something that drew him in closer, even as his mind screamed for him to resist. His body was no longer his own. It responded to her in ways he couldn't control, as though it had a will of its own. "I don't know how to be with someone like this," Eric said, his voice barely a whisper. He was torn between the overwhelming desire to pull away and the undeniable pull toward Nira. Everything about her was so different, so foreign, and yet so familiar. It was as though a part of him had always been meant to be here with her at this moment. "You don't have to know," Nira replied, her voice soothing, like a balm to the uncertainty that burned in his chest. "We can learn together. Whatever this is, it's new for both of us. But I think we're meant to find out what it means." Eric's breath hitched as Nira's fingers drifted down his arm, tracing the outline of his muscles with a delicate touch that sent a shiver through him. He didn't want to respond, didn't want to give in to the growing desire within him, but his body betrayed him. His heart raced, his breath grew shallow, and he could feel the heat between them intensifying. "What if this is a mistake?" he asked, his voice strained. "What if we're doing something we can't take back?" Nira's gaze softened, and she took a small step back, her fingers lingering on his arm before they fell away. "Sometimes the things we're most afraid of are the things we need the most," she said, her words laced with an undeniable wisdom. "The past doesn't matter, Eric. What matters is what we choose now." Eric opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He couldn't speak, not with the way his body responded to her, not with the pull between them growing stronger by the second. His mind screamed at him to resist, but every part of him, every part of his body wanted nothing more than to give in. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled again, the artifact glowing brighter than ever, its energy surging outward like a ripple in a pond. Eric stumbled slightly, feeling disoriented, as if the very fabric of reality had been altered by the artifact's power. The air around them grew thick, charged with an energy that hummed in his bones. "We need to be careful," Eric said, his voice hoarse. He stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for his staff, but Nira caught his wrist before he could pull away. "No," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "We need to trust this. Whatever is happening, we can't fight it. We need to let it unfold." Eric hesitated. The doubts in his mind churned, but they were beginning to lose their strength in the face of something far more powerful, something undeniable. The world around them seemed to pulse with life, as though it, too, was waiting for them to make a choice. Nira stepped forward again, her hand resting lightly on his chest, just over his heart. The touch was warm, grounding, and Eric could feel the heat from her fingertips seeping into him. It was as if she were reaching inside him, finding something he had long buried. "I don't want to be alone anymore," Nira whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the artifact. "And I don't want you to be alone either." Eric's breath caught, the words cutting through him like a knife. He looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment something inside him broke. Something that had been buried for so long, something that had kept him locked away from the world, from connections like this. He had spent so many years alone, so many years fighting against the desires that had slowly been eroded by time. But now, standing here in this moment, with Nira's hand on his chest and the pulsing energy of the artifact between them, he could no longer deny the truth. He wasn't alone anymore, but what would that mean for both of them? As the artifact's glow intensified, Eric's heart raced in his chest. He didn't have the answers. He didn't even know what they were supposed to do next. But whatever it was, he knew they were already too far in to turn back. And as Nira's hand drifted up to his cheek, her touch soft yet insistent, Eric felt the first spark of something new, something that was beginning to burn between them, something they couldn't ignore. But what would happen next? Eric didn't know, but he was ready to find out. The air was thick with the hum of the artifact, its glow pulsing in rhythm with Eric's rapidly beating heart. He couldn't explain it, couldn't fully grasp what was happening between him and Nira, but it was undeniable. The energy between them, between the artifact and their shared proximity, was unlike anything he had ever felt. It was as though the world itself had shifted, and now nothing was certain except the powerful pull they shared. Nira stood before him, her amber eyes never leaving his, an intensity in her gaze that sent a shiver up his spine. Every time she moved, it was as if the very air around them was alive, charged with an electric pulse. Her touch was warm, comforting even, but it also stirred something within him that he couldn't ignore. "I can't stop feeling it," Eric murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "The connection, it's too strong." Nira stepped closer, her eyes softening as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the side of his face. The gentle touch was enough to set his pulse racing, the warmth of her skin seeping into him. "I know," she whispered, her voice low and intimate, filled with a quiet understanding. "I feel it too." He closed his eyes for a moment, struggling to regain his composure, but the energy in the air was undeniable. Every inch of him felt on edge, every sense heightened. The way her breath fell against his ear, the subtle brush of her fingers against his neck, made his body react instinctively, as though it had a will of its own. "This is insane," he breathed, his hands trembling slightly. "We shouldn't be doing this." Nira's lips corked into a knowing smile, her gaze warm, but unrelenting. "Maybe we shouldn't, but it's already happening, Eric, and we can't undo it now." He opened his eyes and met her gaze, his chest tight, as though the very weight of the situation was bearing down on him. He felt the hesitation in his bones, but there was also something else, a longing he had tried to suppress for so long. The world around them had fallen away, leaving only Nira and the undeniable energy between them. "I didn't come here for this," he said, his voice rough. "I came to find answers. I came to understand the artifact, not this." Nira tilted her head slightly, her fingers still resting against his chest, feeling the thrum of his heartbeat under her touch. And yet, here we are. Maybe this is part of the answer you were seeking. Eric's breath hitched as the words sank in. The connection between them, the artifact's power. It was all interwoven in ways he couldn't yet understand, but the pull was unmistakable. The more he resisted, the stronger it seemed to become. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and something darker, something raw. I don't know if I can control this, if I can control myself. Nira's gaze softened, her thumb gently brushing over the fabric of his shirt. Maybe you don't need to control it, Eric. Maybe you need to accept it. Accept what's happening between us. He flinched at her words, as though they cut through him, and yet there was something so alluring in her voice, something that made him want to step forward, to close the distance between them, to give in. His chest tightened, his breath shallow, as the heat in the air around them seemed to build with every passing second. I've spent so many years alone, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to be with someone. Not like this. Not like you. Nira's fingers slid up his arm, the touch gentle but insistent, drawing him closer to her. You don't have to be afraid of that, Eric. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be here, with me. Her words washed over him, each one sinking deep into his chest. He had spent so much time buried in his work, in the world he had built around himself, that he had forgotten how to truly connect with another person. But standing here with Nira, feeling the warmth of her presence, he realized that it wasn't about perfection. It was about something far more elusive, something that couldn't be controlled, only experienced. The artifact pulsed again, brighter now, its glow casting strange shadows over their bodies. Eric felt the energy of it surge through him, the warmth of Nira's touch amplifying the sensations coursing through his veins. His body responded without his consent, and he felt his resolve falter, slipping away like sand through his fingers. I don't know if I can resist you, he confessed, his voice low and ragged. His hands reached for her, hesitantly, his fingers brushing against the curve of her shoulder, his touch shaky, unsure. Nira smiled softly, her eyes gleaming with understanding. You don't have to resist me, Eric. Not if you don't want to. Her words were a balm to his inner turmoil, and for a moment, he found himself closing the distance between them, his hands finding their way to the small of her back, pulling her closer. The heat between them intensified, the pressure building with every breath, and he could feel the electricity in the air surging as the artifact's glow pulsed once more. They stood there for a long moment, their breaths mingling, the air around them crackling with energy. Eric's pulse was loud in his ears, his thoughts swirling in a haze of confusion and desire. He wanted to pull away, to break the connection before it could go any further, but the heat of her body against his, the softness of her skin, the warmth of her breath, made it nearly impossible. I don't know what this means, he murmured, his lips brushing against her temple. I don't know where this is going. Nira's hand slid up his chest, her touch slow and deliberate, sending sparks through him. Neither do I, she said softly. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we don't need to know. We just need to be here now. Her words were a whisper, but they resonated within him, and for a moment, Eric allowed himself to sink into the sensation of her presence, to let go of the thoughts that had clouded his mind. His body was no longer his to command. It moved instinctively, responding to the pull between them. He could feel the warmth of her breath against his lips, the proximity of her body making his heart race even faster. He was torn between the need to give in and the fear of what would happen once he did. But with each passing second, the fear seemed to fade, replaced by something more potent, more urgent. As his lips brushed against hers, tentative at first, the world around them seemed to shift again. The artifact pulsed once more, a deep, resonant hum that filled the clearing. It was as though the very earth had come alive, responding to their connection. And as Eric deepened the kiss, he could feel the moment stretching out, the tension between them growing, the world outside of them fading entirely. But just as their kiss grew more intense, a sudden, sharp crack sounded through the clearing, and the pulse of the artifact surged, sending a jolt of energy through them both. Eric stumbled back, his heart racing, as the energy of the artifact intensified. "What is happening?" he gasped, his breath ragged. Nira's expression shifted, a mixture of confusion and awe in her eyes. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think we've awakened something." The artifact's glow blazed brighter, and the world around them seemed to shift again, darker, more foreboding. Eric's heart pounded, his instincts screaming at him that they were in over their heads. But Nira's hand was still in his, her grip firm, and somehow he knew they weren't going to turn back now. The pulse of the artifact grew stronger, its glow bathing the entire clearing in an intense light. The air around them seemed to crackle, the very fabric of reality trembling beneath its power. Eric stumbled back, his breath shallow, trying to make sense of what was happening. His heart raced, his body still trembling from the unexpected surge of energy that had filled the air moments before. Nira stood at his side, her expression unreadable as she looked at the artifact, then back at Eric. Her fingers twitched at her sides, and for a moment, he thought she might step forward again, might try to close the distance between them. But instead, she stood still, her gaze flicking from the artifact to his face, a silent understanding passing between them. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "The way the air has changed? The way the artifact is alive?" Eric nodded, his throat dry. He could feel it, feel the thrum of the magic that seemed to vibrate through the air, through his very bones. It was as if the world around them was on the edge of something, something just out of reach, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on them both. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice hoarse. "The energy, it's growing stronger. It's almost like it's feeding off of us." Nira glanced at him, her amber eyes narrowed in thought. "It is," she murmured. "The artifact reacts to emotions, to the connection between us. And right now it's feeding off everything, the attraction, the tension, the uncertainty. It's becoming more powerful, more unstable." Eric looked at the artifact again, his gaze drawn to the swirling light at its core. It pulsed, as if in rhythm with his heartbeat, and he could see the edges of reality beginning to distort, the trees around them warping and twisting. It was as if the artifact was rewriting the world itself, bending it to its will. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice strained. "How do we stop it?" Nira shook her head, her expression a mixture of concern and resolve. "I don't think we can stop it. At least not now. We need to understand it. We need to know what it wants, what it needs from us." Eric felt a pang of unease. He had never been one to blindly follow instincts, to trust the unknown, but the pull of the artifact, combined with the energy between him and Nira, made it hard to think clearly. His mind was clouded, his thoughts jumbled, and he couldn't escape the feeling that everything they did from here on out would lead them down a path from which there was no return. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he admitted, his voice rough. "I don't know if I can handle whatever comes next." Nira reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm in a comforting gesture. Her touch sent a wave of warmth through him, grounding him in the chaos that surrounded them. "We don't have to know what's next, Eric. We're in this together. And whatever happens, we'll face it together." For a moment, the words lingered in the air between them, and Eric could feel the sincerity in her voice. There was something comforting in the way she spoke, as though she had no doubts about their ability to navigate whatever dangers lay ahead. But even as her touch steadied him, he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. The artifact pulsed again, brighter this time, and Eric felt a shift in the air, a strange pressure building in the atmosphere. The trees around them seemed to bend under the force, and the ground trembled as though the earth itself was reacting to the artifact's energy. "We need to find out what this is," Eric said, his voice firm, despite the fear that clung to him. "We need to understand its purpose before it's too late." Nira nodded, her gaze flicking between the artifact and the surrounding forest. "I agree, but how? We don't even know where it came from or how it works. We need to get closer. The thought of getting any closer to the artifact made Eric's stomach twist. The energy it radiated was palpable, and he wasn't sure he could withstand much more of its influence. But Nira's determination seemed to light a fire in him, and he found himself nodding despite the hesitation in his chest. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "We'll approach together." They moved cautiously toward the artifact, the tension in the air thickening with every step. Eric could feel the heat of the artifact as they drew nearer, the pressure building in his chest. He was acutely aware of Nira beside him, her presence a calming force in the midst of the chaos. Every so often, he would glance at her, meeting her gaze for a brief moment before looking back at the artifact, as though the sight of her brought him some small measure of clarity. When they were within a few feet of the artifact, the light surrounding it flared once more, blinding in its intensity. Eric instinctively shielded his eyes, his heart hammering in his chest as the power surged, filling the clearing with an overwhelming energy. "I can't," he began, but his voice was drowned out by the rising hum of the artifact. The sound was deafening, vibrating through his entire body. It was as though the artifact was alive, calling out to them, demanding something he wasn't sure he was prepared to give. Nira stepped forward, her hand outstretched, as though she were drawn to the light, her expression unreadable. "It wants us," she whispered. "It's calling us, Eric." His heart skipped a beat at the intensity of her words. He didn't know what she meant by calling, but there was something in the way she moved, in the way she was drawn to the artifact, that made him question everything he had believed up to this point. What was happening? What were they being pulled into? The light of the artifact flickered, and for a moment, Eric thought he saw something shift in the air. Something more than just the distortion of light and shadow. It was as if the fabric of reality itself was beginning to warp, and he could feel the pull of it growing stronger with every passing second. Nira didn't stop. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the surface of the artifact, and in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The air stilled, the sound of the humming energy fading into an eerie silence. Eric's breath caught in his throat as he watched Nira's fingers make contact with the artifact. There was a flash of light, blinding in its intensity, and Eric instinctively stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grasp hers. The moment their skin made contact, a shockwave of energy rippled through them both. Eric gasped, his body seizing under the force of it, as the ground beneath them trembled. The air around them seemed to fracture, and in that instant, he felt as though the very space they occupied had been torn open. "Nira!" he shouted, his voice frantic as the world around them began to unravel. But before he could reach her, before he could pull her away from the artifact, everything went dark. And then there was nothing. Eric's head throbbed as he regained consciousness, a dull ache pulsating through his skull. The air was thick with a heavy silence, the kind that made every breath feel like a disruption. Slowly, he opened his eyes, the world around him blurry and unsteady. His surroundings were unfamiliar. No longer the clearing where he and Nira had stood, facing the artifact, but instead, a dimly lit space that seemed to stretch infinitely. The edges of the world around him blurred and flickered like a broken painting. He groaned, lifting himself from the cold, uneven ground. His limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as though he'd been submerged in water. His thoughts were muddled, disconnected. His heart raced in his chest as panic surged. Where was Nira? "Nira!" he called out, his voice hoarse and weak, but it echoed in the stillness, unanswered. He forced himself to stand, trying to steady his breathing as he scanned the strange space around him. The walls, or was it the air itself, seemed to shimmer, their shapes shifting like a mirage. A faint, distant hum reverberated through the air. It was soft at first, but as Eric concentrated, it grew louder, more familiar. The hum that had come from the artifact. "Nira!" His voice cracked this time, desperation creeping in. He took a step forward, his feet unsteady, but something in the atmosphere pulled him, guiding him deeper into the strange world he had been thrust into. It felt like a dream, like he wasn't truly awake, but the sensations in his body were too real, too intense for him to ignore. The air was warmer here. The hum of energy was growing, vibrating in his chest, as if resonating with something deep inside him. Eric's thoughts returned to the last moments he remembered, the moment he had touched the artifact with Nira. The flash of light, the energy, the sense of tearing through reality. He hadn't imagined it. He wasn't sure how, but somehow they had crossed into another plane, another reality entirely. He took another step, then froze. Through the shifting haze, a shape appeared. One he hadn't expected. A figure. Nira. She was standing a few feet away, her back to him, her form silhouetted by a soft, radiant glow. The light around her shimmered like the haze of a distant fire, both familiar and otherworldly. Nira. His voice was barely a whisper, as if the words might shatter the delicate balance of the space around them. She turned slowly, her amber eyes locking onto his, the expression on her face unreadable. The glow surrounding her pulsed with energy, casting shifting shadows over her face. Eric's breath caught in his throat at the sight of her. She looked the same, yet different. There was something ethereal about her, something untouchable, as though she were no longer fully present in the same way he was. "You're here?" Eric breathed, a mixture of relief and confusion flooding his chest. "But where are we?" Nira's lips parted, but she did not immediately speak. Her gaze swept over him, as though she were assessing him, measuring the very air between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft, yet somehow filled with an unearthly echo. "I don't know," she said, her words lingering, "but we are somewhere else, somewhere between worlds." Eric took a hesitant step forward, drawn to her, but the distance between them seemed to grow. The energy around her flickered, like the flames of a fire that refused to settle. His heart raced again, the sense of urgency rising within him. "Nira, I don't understand. What happened?" His voice cracked, emotion creeping into his words. "When we touched it, I thought we were going to be destroyed, but now we're here, in this place." Nira's gaze softened, though her eyes never left his. The energy around her shimmered once more, and she took a slow step toward him, the distance between them still too far for comfort. "I don't know what happened," she admitted, her voice low, "but I think we awakened something. The artifact, it doesn't just hold power, creates, connects, and now we're part of its energy, part of its force." Eric felt a cold shiver run down his spine at her words. The implication was clear. They weren't just in another place, another dimension. They were inside the very power they had tried to control. They had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. "We're part of it?" Eric echoed, his mind struggling to make sense of the words. Nira nodded, her face serious, though there was an almost haunted quality to her expression. "Yes, the artifact connected us. It bonded us with its energy. We can't escape it now, not unless we understand it." Eric's heart skipped a beat. The thought of being bound to something so mysterious, so powerful, terrified him. But more than that, there was a deeper fear that gnawed at him. What would the artifact do to them, to their connection, as time passed? Would they change? Would they be able to resist the overwhelming force of its pull? "How do we understand it?" Eric asked, his voice shaking with uncertainty. He stepped closer, wanting to reach her, to feel her presence more than just the glowing figure she seemed to be. "What do we do now?" Nira's gaze softened, and she stepped closer to him. The light around her flickered again, but this time, it wasn't just the glow of the artifact. The warmth radiating from her seemed to resonate with him, something deeper than physical warmth. It was as if the bond between them had shifted, now intertwining with the artifact's energy. "We have to face it together," she said, her words almost a whisper. "We have to understand what it wants from us." Eric stood frozen for a moment, absorbing the gravity of her words. The energy between them was palpable, and though he wanted to reach for her, to pull her close and seek comfort in the touch he'd grown to crave, something held him back. This place, the artifact, it wasn't just about desire. It was about power, something far greater, far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. We can't just give in to it, Eric said, his voice firm, though his heart still raced. We have to be careful. We need to learn everything we can about what we're dealing with. Nira nodded again, her face hardening in determination. We will, she said, her voice resolute. We'll learn together, but we need to move quickly. I can feel it. The artifact is already changing, growing stronger. It's feeding off of us, off of this connection. And soon, it might take more than we're willing to give. Eric's gaze met hers, and for the first time since they had crossed into this strange place, he felt a flicker of hope. They weren't alone in this. They were in it together, and no matter what came next, he knew they would face it side by side. The air around them began to ripple again, the energy growing more intense, and Eric's heart began to race once more. They didn't have much time. Whatever came next, it was coming fast, but they would face it together. Eric and Nira moved deeper into the shifting space, the strange energy pulsing around them like a living thing. The air felt heavy, laden with a strange force that seemed to seep into their skin, to fill their lungs with an electric charge. Every step they took seemed to reverberate through the ground, the walls, and the very fabric of the world around them. It was as if they were walking through a dream, one that threatened to swallow them whole if they didn't stay grounded. The rhythmic hum of the artifact grew louder, almost deafening now, filling the void between them with its steady, unrelenting pulse. Eric could feel it in his chest, the beat of it syncing with the thumping of his heart, as though his very soul was resonating with the power that surrounded them. And Nira, she was the source of that connection. Her presence, her energy, seemed to draw the artifact's power like a magnet. It was as if the two of them were linked, bound together by forces they didn't fully understand. Do you feel it? Nira asked, her voice soft but urgent as she reached out to touch his arm. The touch was light, but there was something about it, something that made Eric's breath hitch in his throat. The artifact, it's connecting to us, to our energy. We need to be careful. Eric nodded, his mouth dry. He could feel it. Something inside him, something raw and primal, was awakening. The artifact wasn't just pulling them together in the way he had imagined. It was changing them. He could feel it in every part of his body, in the way his pulse quickened whenever their hands brushed, in the way his thoughts grew clouded when she was near. I don't know if I can control this, he admitted, his voice hoarse as he glanced at her, his eyes locking onto hers. There was something about the intensity of the moment, something that made his body ache with desire. But it wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that went beyond touch. Nira stepped closer, her eyes reflecting the dim light of the space around them. Her expression softened as she studied him, the intensity in her gaze not lost on Eric. She seemed to sense his inner turmoil, the unspoken fear that hung between them. You're not alone in this, Eric, she said, her voice a low whisper. We're in this together. Whatever the artifact is doing to us, we have to face it together. Her words, soothing as they were, only deepened the confusion and uncertainty in his chest. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that they could face whatever came next with unwavering resolve. But the connection between them, this strange electric bond that was growing stronger with every passing moment, wasn't just something they could control. It was a force of nature, something far more powerful than either of them could truly understand. They continued forward, the shifting walls closing in on them, though there seemed to be no real sense of direction. Every turn they made, every step they took, only seemed to lead them deeper into the maze of energy that surrounded them. It was as if the space itself was alive, a sentient being that was molding their path with every breath. Do you hear that? Eric asked suddenly, his voice tinged with concern. He paused, looking around, trying to locate the source of the sound that had now woven its way into the hum of the artifact. It was a soft whisper, a voice barely audible above the constant hum. Mira's head snapped to the side, her body tensing. I hear it, she replied, her voice tight with unease. It's coming from over there. Eric turned to follow her gaze, but the shifting walls distorted everything. The path ahead seemed to twist and ripple as if the space itself was playing tricks on them. He felt the pressure in his chest tighten, and a sense of foreboding washed over him. It wasn't just the artifact's power that they were up against. It was something else, something darker. Suddenly, the walls parted, revealing a darkened alcove, its edges swirling with light and shadow. The air was thick with the same energy, but now there was something different, something darker, more ominous. The whispers seemed louder now, growing more insistent, as though they were being beckoned forward. Without speaking, Eric and Nira moved toward the alcove, the air around them thick with the weight of what lay ahead. As they entered the space, the light dimmed, and the energy became almost suffocating. Eric could feel the artifact's hum vibrating through his very being, an overwhelming force that was both terrifying and intoxicating. In the center of the alcove, there was another artifact, smaller than the one they had first encountered, but no less powerful. It pulsed with the same energy, its glow flickering in time with the beat of their hearts. But this time, it wasn't just the power of the artifact that drew them in. It was something else, a deep, almost primal urge that tugged at the very core of their being. Nira's hand found Eric's, her fingers trembling slightly as she grasped his. The contact sent a shockwave of energy through him, his heart racing as the warmth of her touch spread through his chest. The bond between them, already strong, seemed to intensify, and Eric felt his thoughts cloud with the force of it. "What is this?" Eric asked, his voice strained as he struggled to keep his mind focused on the task at hand. "Why does it feel like?" Before he could finish, the artifact's glow brightened, the energy in the room spiking. Eric gasped as the force of it swept over them, a rush of heat and pressure filling the space. The hum of the artifact became deafening, and the world around them began to blur once more. Nira stumbled forward, her body colliding with his, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Their faces were inches apart, their breath shallow and quick as the energy surged around them. Eric's pulse thudded in his ears, the sensation of Nira's presence overwhelming him in ways he didn't understand. He reached for her, his hand trembling as he cupped her face. The connection between them flared, and for a moment, he felt like he was drowning in it, lost in the intensity of the bond that had formed between them. He could feel the heat of her skin against his, the soft pressure of her body against his chest, and everything else faded into the background. "Nira," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how much longer I can resist this." Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he saw something flicker in them, something raw and powerful, something that mirrored his own desire. But even as their bodies responded to the pull between them, a warning rang through Eric's mind. The artifact wasn't just changing them, it was forcing them to confront something deeper, something primal. And the longer they stayed in its presence, the more difficult it would be to maintain control. Before Eric could speak again, the artifact's energy flared one final time, and everything went black. The last thing Eric felt before the darkness consumed him was the warmth of Nira's touch, her presence lingering in the void. Eric's eyes fluttered open, his body heavy and disoriented. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The last thing he remembered was the powerful surge of energy, the overwhelming pulse of the artifact, and then darkness. Now, the air around him felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight that had filled the space before was gone, replaced by a strange sense of quiet stillness. As he pushed himself up, he realized he wasn't alone. Nira was sitting beside him, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern. She was looking at him, her eyes wide, as if waiting for him to speak, to make sense of the strange turn their journey had taken. Eric ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the lingering fog in his mind. Where are we?" Nira's voice was soft, but there was a tremor to it. "I don't know," she replied. "One moment, everything went dark, and then this place just appeared. It's like we're in a completely different world." Eric looked around, taking in his surroundings. They were no longer in the shifting, pulsating maze. Instead, they were standing in what appeared to be a vast, open space, almost like a field, though it was far too still, too calm. The sky above them was a deep, ethereal purple, with wisps of light dancing across the horizon. The ground beneath them was smooth and glimmering, like stardust spread out over an endless plain. There was no sign of the artifact, no trace of the energy that had consumed them before. "This doesn't feel real," Eric murmured, stepping forward tentatively. His footsteps echoed in the stillness, the only sound in the otherwise silent landscape. Nira stood up, following his lead, her movements graceful and fluid. She looked around, her eyes scanning the empty expanse as if searching for something. "It's not just that," she said, her voice quieter now. "I feel different, like something inside me has changed." Eric glanced at her, noting the subtle shift in her expression. Her eyes seemed sharper, more alert, as though something had unlocked within her. He couldn't deny that he felt it too. The connection between them, once a distant hum in the background, now felt much stronger. The bond between them seemed to vibrate with a newfound intensity, an undeniable pull that urged them to stay close. He took a step toward her, his instincts pulling him in her direction. "Nira, what do you think happened to us? What was that artifact?" She shook her head slowly. "I don't know, but I think it did something to us, something we don't fully understand yet." They were standing close now, their gazes locked in a silent understanding. The air around them seemed to hum with a new energy, a different kind of force than what had existed before. It wasn't the artifact itself, but something more personal, something between them. Eric could feel it like a thread, tugging at his very soul. Nira's breath caught as she looked up at him, and Eric's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the way she was looking at him, something deeper than mere curiosity. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the precipice of something they both feared and longed for in equal measure. "I don't know how much longer I can keep my distance," Eric said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. It felt like an admission, a truth he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. Nira's gaze softened, and she stepped even closer. "You don't have to. We're connected now, Eric. The artifact, it brought us together, and I don't think it's something we can undo." Her words struck a chord deep within him, resonating with an intensity that made his pulse race. He wanted to step back to maintain the space between them, but he couldn't. Not when the pull was so strong, so undeniable. His breath quickened, and he swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "I don't want to pull away," he confessed, his voice low and rough. "But I don't know what this means, what it could mean for us." Nira's hand reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm, sending a jolt of warmth through his body. "I don't know either," she whispered, her voice tender. "But I'm not afraid. Not anymore." The touch of her hand felt like a spark, igniting a fire within him. It was as if their bond had evolved, becoming something more than just the physical connection they had once shared. Now there was a deeper understanding between them, a mutual recognition of the feelings they both tried to suppress. Eric's hand moved instinctively to her cheek, his thumb brushing against the softness of her skin. Her eyes fluttered closed for a moment, and Eric felt his chest tighten at the vulnerability in her expression. He had never seen her like this, not with this raw openness, this quiet surrender. He leaned in, his breath mingling with hers. The space between them seemed to shrink, the world around them fading as their connection took center stage. Just as he was about to close the gap between them completely, a sudden crackling sound broke the stillness. Both of them froze, the moment shattered as quickly as it had come. The crackling noise grew louder, and Eric's eyes snapped open, his pulse racing with a mix of anticipation and dread. Something was happening, something they hadn't anticipated. Before they could react, the ground beneath them began to tremble, the soft light in the distance flickering ominously. The silence that had once surrounded them was replaced by a low rumble, like a distant storm building on the horizon. Nira looked around, her face tense with concern. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the growing noise. Eric's gaze locked onto the source of the disturbance, a shifting mass of shadow and light swirling together in the distance. It was hard to make sense of it, but whatever it was drawing closer. Fast. I don't know, Eric replied, his voice tight, but I think we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Nira nodded, her eyes steely with determination. Together, she said, her voice strong. Eric's heart raced as the shadows continued to move toward them. He knew that whatever they had just awakened, whatever bond they had formed, was about to be tested in ways they couldn't yet understand. And whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. As the shadows neared, a surge of energy pulsed through the ground beneath them, a warning of the storm to come. The air was thick with anticipation, and the first crack of thunder sounded in the distance. The storm was closer now, the dark shadows swirling around them with a force that shook the very ground beneath their feet. Eric's heart raced as he instinctively reached for Nira's hand, pulling her closer to him. She didn't resist, her gaze locked onto the approaching chaos, her expression a mix of defiance and resolve. "What is it?" Nira asked, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. "I don't know," Eric replied, trying to steady his breathing. The energy that had brought them here seemed to have shifted, become darker. The storm wasn't just a physical manifestation. It was something deeper, an emotional weight in the air that pressed on him, suffocating him. But we're not going to face it alone. They stood together, side by side, ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead. The shadows grew more defined, their edges sharp and jagged, swirling like tendrils reaching for them. The ground vibrated underfoot as the first crack of lightning split the sky, illuminating the vast expanse around them. The space between them and the approaching storm was now so small, the force of the wind whipping around them, carrying with it the scent of something ancient, something primal. It tugged at their bond, pulling at their connection like a thread being drawn tighter and tighter. Eric squeezed her hand, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the culmination of everything they had faced. This wasn't just about the artifact or the strange bond they had formed. It was about something far greater, something that transcended their understanding. They had become part of a story larger than themselves. "Nira?" Eric's voice was almost lost in the storm, but he spoke anyway, trying to convey what he couldn't put into words. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." She nodded, her eyes soft with a shared understanding. Always, with a final, powerful gust of wind, the shadows descended upon them. But just before they could fully envelop them, the light in the distance flared brightly, cutting through the darkness like a blade. A force, pure and unyielding, pushed against the storm, creating a barrier between the shadows and the two of them. Eric could feel it. He felt it deep within his chest, a pulse that matched his heartbeat. It was as if the very bond they had formed had manifested into this shield, protecting them. For a moment, everything stood still. The storm raged around them, but it couldn't touch them. Eric stood there, heart pounding, as he realized the magnitude of what had happened. This wasn't just a temporary escape. It was a transformation. The artifact, their connection, the bond they had forged in the heat of uncertainty. This was what had protected them. Nira's grip on his hand tightened. "It's us, isn't it?" she asked, her voice soft but full of wonder. "We've done this. We've changed everything." Eric looked down at their hands, entwined, the pulse between them stronger than ever. "I think we have," he said quietly. They stood in silence for a moment longer, the storm still raging around them but unable to break through. It was as if the very fabric of the world had shifted, and the bond they had created was the key to holding the chaos at bay. But it wasn't over. The light from the distance grew even brighter, and the storm began to recede, the shadows slowly dissolving into the air, retreating like a fading nightmare. Eric watched, mesmerized, as the world around them began to return to normal. The strange, unearthly landscape began to shift again, its vibrant colors calming, the glowing purple sky dimming into a soft, pale hue. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world was still. Eric exhaled slowly, the tension in his body easing. He turned to Nira, his gaze searching hers, and for the first time since the storm had started, he saw something new in her eyes, something serene, something peaceful. They had made it through. I guess we finally won, he said, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. Nira smiled, the curve of her lips gentle and knowing. We haven't won, she said softly, but we found something much more important than that. She took a step toward him, closing the small gap between them. Eric felt his heart beat faster as the air around them seemed to hum with anticipation. There was no more fear, no more uncertainty. Only the presence of the bond they had created, stronger than anything they had faced before. They stood there, just for a moment, basking in the shared understanding that they had changed the course of their lives, and possibly the fate of this world. What they had experienced together, what they had survived, had transformed them in ways they couldn't yet fully comprehend. But for now, that was enough. Nira's hand reached up to touch his face, her fingers brushing against his cheek with a tenderness that spoke volumes. Eric closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the simple touch, the warmth of her skin against his. They had come so far together, and now, finally, they could face whatever came next as equals. As the last remnants of the storm faded into the distance, Eric opened his eyes, meeting Nira's gaze. There was no more tension, no more need for words. They had been through the fire together and come out stronger, their bond unbreakable. I think we're ready for whatever comes next, Eric said softly. Nira nodded, her smile soft but sure. Together, she said, her voice a promise. And as the light of the new world spread out before them, Eric knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it side by side.